It's a great privilege to be and to share with you something that I've been very curious about, and I'm sure many of you have been very curious about, and maybe even frustrated about. Like Eli Goldratt, I think this question was a curiosity and a frustration, and he tried to answer it in many articles that he wrote over the years. One of those was, where's the rush for TOC? So about a year and a half ago, I have frequent calls with Eli Schragenheim. We love brainstorming together and thinking about new problems to look at. And I said to him, what is your answer to this question is, why is the adoption of theory of constraints still significantly below our own expectations? Not just the adoption, but the awareness. I mentioned to him, I started lecturing at Duke, and there was a big class of entrepreneurs and business leaders, about 100 people in the room. And I said to them, how many of you know about theory of constraints? And there were very few hands that went up. Then when I talked about Goldratt and the gold, a bit more hands went up. And I said, how many of you that read the book really liked it, enjoyed it? Actually, it was the best book I've ever read, many of them said. How many of you have implemented it? And the hands just dropped. And this was a very frequent experiment that Dr. Eli Goldratt did in presentations that he did. He would ask people, how many of you have read the goal? And of course, with being presenter, many hands would go up. How many of you have implemented? And they would drop. So what I like to do is to share with you what has come out of our analysis. Some of the conclusions, I think, are pretty intuitive. And there are a few that were not that intuitive, that maybe even surprise us. And please treat this as just a first version of this. We would encourage you to contribute to this. We have written a paper about this. And if you send Marsha or myself an email, our email addresses will be at the end of the presentation. We'd love to share the article with you and get your contributions and feedback on it. So let's start. What is the exam question and hypothesis? Why, despite so many successes, is the awareness, adoption, and value realization of theory of constraints still so low? So what we did in the paper, we said, well, let's not assume that there is even agreement on what we mean by theory of constraints. And as myself and Eli started looking at this, we realized that there's really 4 aspects to it. There's the theory part behind theory of constraints. There are the principles on which it is based. There are the applications like drum buffer rope, critical chain project management, throughput accounting. These are essentially decision rules that help us to live in complex worlds. And then there are the TOC tools, like the 5 focusing steps, the thinking process, etc. As far as the theory part is concerned, I've often been asked, so why is it called a theory? It's a really terrible idea from a marketing perspective. We need something practical, not a theory. And I always remind them of this beautiful quote by Dr. Kurt Lewin, who was one of the pioneers in psychology. And he said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. So in science, you can make a number of contributions. You can contribute a consequential problem. I call these sort of the 5 C's when I supervise PhD students. Consequential problem, something that previously people didn't realize existed, or they didn't realize the full extent of it. That could be a contribution to your domain or field of science. That's the first C. The second C is classification. What are the parts of the system that we are talking about? That could be another contribution. Then, of course, there's correlation. How do these parts relate to each other? And then there's causality, and finally there's a commercial application of it. The theory component is really trying to answer a very simple question. That's the causality part. Is why do they relate to each other like this? And when we read a theory, somebody has contributed a theory. As a scientist, you expect to hear some good explanation about why this thing is important. So and consequential and useful. Theory of relativity. What is meant by relativity and why is it important to consider? So when we talk about theory of constraints, in the article, we provide quite a bit of details about that, but it's really useful in 5 areas. Knowing the constraint of a system for anybody is really useful because it helps us to set ambitious but achievable goals. It helps us to decide what to focus on. It helps us to judge the impact of changes on the system. It helps us to decide what rules to use to manage the whole system. It turns out that the rules to optimize a constraint is also the rules to optimize the whole system, if it's a stable system with a single constraint. And lastly, it helps us to decide when to change the rules, when a constraint moves or the system becomes unstable. So we started by looking at that and said, okay, we have a good enough agreement on what theory of constraints is to now ask the question, go back to the question, so why is the awareness still so low? Why is the adoption low? And why is the value realization low? And what we did was, we thought, let's practice what we preach, something that you all will know is very hard to do. Let's use TOC to analyze TOC. And let's stand on the shoulders of giants. And there were two particular giants that we selected on. Ellie was one of them. And another one was Prof. Russ Ackoff, that I had the privilege of having as one of my external supervisors. Prof. Russ Ackoff was one of the founders and pioneers in systems thinking. And he wrote a beautiful article called Why Few Companies Adopt Systems Thinking. So I'll share a bit of the insights, and then I'll end up with some insights and recommendations. And like with most complicated topics, it's very seldom that you make very firm statements about what to stop and start doing. There are things that I think we found and that you're probably aware of that we really should stop doing that because it's not helping, it's probably harming. But the rest are more do less of this and do more of that. So let's go right into it. Who of you have heard of the Dunningkruger Effect? Can I see a show of hands? It's a wonderful research study that was done, and the effect was the outcome of that research study to look at the correlation between experience and confidence. And you'd kind of imagine that that could be a straight line, starting from very low experience, low confidence, to very high experience and therefore high confidence. But you get this interesting phenomena, and the researchers called the spike Mount Stupid. Mount Stupid, right? If you don't hear that. It's a terrible name, but it's kind of accurate description because it says that here's somebody that's gained a little bit of experience in this field, but it's not enough that allows them to know what they don't know. So they're completely overconfident. And then soon after that, things become reality and they go down. So you can kind of almost identify where somebody is in this journey of gaining experience in any topic, including TOC, by kind of what their reaction is. What's that? If you ask people, do you know about theory of constraints? And then they learn a little bit and they go, I get it. And then I go, wait a minute, this is a bit tricky. And then, oh my gosh, I'll never get this. And then finally, trust me, it's complicated. Right? And interesting enough, it's based on the bit of research that we've done is any one of those states or emotions can cause people to either try it or not to try it. The one that's really confident is the one, I got this. Why? Because ignorance is bliss, right? So a question to you all is, where are you on your TOC journey? Which of those reactions best describe where you are at? When people ask me how you're doing, I always say nervously excited. Mostly just nervous. Because I'm kind of in this between, I'll never get this, versus, trust me, it's complicated. Now, we used to do an incredible workshop in theory of constraints, for those of you that remember, using simulators. And what did we want to do with these simulators? Is we wanted to make people aware of the fact that their conclusion about what's causing their poor performance really should be challenged, and it's probably wrong. So if you remember those old workshops where you would invite people in and you say, you're going to do a workshop on operations management, and you said, how bad is your performance compared to your target in terms of due date performance or lead times? And it's normally there was a big gap. And they said, so what makes it so difficult to close this gap? And people would start writing reasons, right? Customers frequently change their mind, machines break down, people are not productive, I sometimes run out of raw materials, etc. And you'd get this long list. At some point, you'd have to stop them, and you'd ask them to look at the list and see what's in common. And the only thing that was in common was, it's not my fault. And you could use the simulation as a way of proving to them that we have found the enemy, it is us. How could we do that? Because we could use the simulation and say, what if I gave you this virtual company where none of those things existed? Would you be able to make money? And they would go, of course. And then you'd give them the simulation, and they'd soon, that confidence level would drop. after the first round, right? They would go from very, very confident that they could make money to suddenly losing money, and then they go, let me just try it again. I'll try it again, I'll play, and then they lose even more money or about the same. And so it was a way of showing people that you are overconfident about what the real cause is behind your poor performance. And the simulation was useful for another reason, in that we could show them that just by changing a rule, you could dramatically improve the performance. And that would give them a bit of confidence, hopefully, to go and try it. But any rule that you make a change in an organization is quite complicated. So unless you support them, often these rules wouldn't be implemented. So if you think about could we say that in this question as well, why is the awareness and adoption and value realization so low? Who's to blame? And there's always somebody to blame. So our early conclusion was it's definitely us. For a number of reasons. We are overconfident. We think that TOC is a silver bullet for everything. It's not. It has, like any solution, it has boundary conditions where it works, and outside of those it doesn't work. There are certain rules. We have to understand where it works and where it won't. We undersell ourselves, and as a result, we don't project the confidence that people often need when they have to make a decision about what to go and do, right? And often we charge too little, so it looks like the value is very low. We all suffer from inertia. We are asking people to follow methods that we don't ourselves use. Why is that? We teach current reality trees, future reality trees, and yet most of you would never use it as a practical tool, but we still teach it. Why is that? It's inertia. We compromise and often tolerate it and find somebody else to blame for why the TOC project didn't succeed. Now, these are obviously horrible, but they're human tendencies. So, of course, we are all special, but we're not unique. We all suffer from this. We overcomplicate. We don't focus and finish, like Sanjeev mentioned this morning. We don't use fast feedback. We try to market, and we don't listen to what's working and what's not working. We don't try multiple experiments. These are just simple things that we could do, but we don't. We local optimize, often. One thing is about education. People don't want to pay for knowledge. We charge a lot for knowledge. Why is that? And should we be surprised that then the uptake of buying knowledge for a couple of $100 is just not happening? We're just not getting enough. Shouldn't we give it away for free and find other ways of monetizing? And lastly, we don't always practice what we preach. So we thought, let's start there. And let's listen to Elliot. We want to make a breakthrough in this environment. He said, to make a breakthrough, we can all do it. We can all be outstanding scientists. We just need to follow 2 steps. Have the courage to face inconsistencies and be willing to challenge basic assumptions. So what's inconsistency in an awareness and adoption of TOC, and what assumptions can and probably should be challenged? So facing an inconsistency, we have lots of references, right? Amazing companies that have benefited from implementing TOC. Those are just the ones I've personally worked with. And you can keep on adding and adding and adding. We have enough references. Even Amazon, we had this amazing reference from Jeff Bezos that came out that says the goal is one of 3 books that he gives his executives to read. They use it to think forward into the future. He said in his book that TOC was a foundation of building the supply chain for Amazon. So it can't be that we don't have enough references. So why is it that the awareness and adoption and value realization is still so low? So what we did was we said, well, if we looked at it, how big is this gap between our expectations and what we see in reality in all 3 of those areas? And you can see the awareness, there's a big gap. Adoption is even bigger, and value realization in terms of what TOC potentially could do for the world is even bigger. So challenging assumptions, you can challenge 2 types of assumptions when you have such an expectation gap or inconsistency. You can challenge the assumptions on which your expectation was based. Could it be that our expectations were too high? What do you think? It could very well be, and you have to be open to the fact that your expectation was simply too high for many reasons. One of those very simple reasons is that there are always infinitely more ways that something can fail compared to what is required for something to succeed. There's a great quote that said, failure requires no explanation, success does. Very few ways to succeed. Many, many ways to fail. Poverty doesn't require explanation, wealth does. So paying attention to this, it's kind of like, we get married, we all have expectations that we'll be living happily ever after, and we ignore the data that at least 50% of us will get divorced, and the ones that don't, 80% of those will be pretty unhappy. The rest will tolerate it, and there's a few small cases that will live happily ever after. So maybe our expectations were just too high, but it could also be that they're too low, and this is one of the things that Ellie always challenged us on. Don't have your expectations too low. So we thought maybe that's not a mistake that we've made. We had pretty high expectations, and probably they found it, and I'll show you, for those that didn't see it, where those expectations came from. What was the founding assumptions? The second assumption we can and should challenge is maybe the assumptions on which the actions that we took to realize those expectations ended up being wrong. So could it be that the actions we agreed as a community or as individual businesses, those actions that we took, could it be that some of them weren't necessary and they wasted our limited attention? Could it be that even though they were necessary, they weren't sufficient? Or maybe there were actions there that we took that were in conflict with the goal that we were trying to achieve. So let's look at where that expectation came from. Ellie presented this at one of the first TOC-ICO conferences, a kind of a goal for us as a community. Make TOC the main way of managing organizations. And he not just stepped there, but he said, in order to achieve that, these are the necessary conditions that will probably have to be in place. There might be ones that we've missed, but we'll find them. The only way to test sufficiency in reality is to start and do it and check. Did we have a process to take organizations from ignorance, which means we weren't aware of TOC, all the way to full adoption? And that was the objective of the viable vision process. Beautifully designed sales funnel. Create a seminar, tell people that it's probably possible for them to turn their top line into bottom line. If you're interested to know if it's possible for you to come to the seminar and pay to be sold, right? Wonderful seminar. Patrick was telling the story yesterday, and Henry was telling the story yesterday about then being invited to this 2-hour meeting with Ellie, right? Where he could check if this was possible for your company. And then you would agree with a handshake on a huge contract. And you would go through. That process was designed to take this. And we learned a tremendous amount, both what worked and what didn't work. There were some other necessary conditions that we knew had to be put in place. We needed support from the professional community. We needed to provide people access to the knowledge. We need to make these implementations known, but we also need to learn from them, not just publish the ones that worked, but publish the ones that didn't work. Something that we all accuse academics of, and Big Pharma, they only publish the things that work, not the things that failed, and that's where we learn from. And then take whatever other actions is to ensure TOC becomes the main way. And there were a few key assumptions in the format of a strategy and tactic tree. Ellie claimed that he believed making TOC was viable because, why is it difficult? Is that switching from a conventional way to the TOC way was composed of many paradigm shifts, and institutionalizing even a single paradigm shift is not easy. And it could be that we completely underestimated this, how difficult it is to get people to adopt even a single new paradigm, and we're asking them to adopt multiple ones at the same time. And kind of there was an expectation why we thought it was possible because of the common sense logic of TOC. We had a huge reference bank that we could point to, and maybe those things were just not sufficient. So let's go to exposing and challenging some basic assumptions. Russ Ackoff wrote a beautiful article, as I mentioned, Why Few Organizations Adopt Systems Thinking. And he said there's a generic reason and a specific reason. The generic reason is, why do organizations not adopt any change? And he said there's a deep fear within managers that they will be blamed if any radical change they actively supported failed. So as soon as the change sounds radical or high risk, then it's just personally much safer to passively support it. If you actively went against it, that's also dangerous. So you got a lot of lip service. Oh, that's so great. Yeah, good luck with that, guys. If you need my help, just ask for it. The specific reason is that practitioners and experts of new approaches develop and use language that can make it appear overly complicated. And myself and Ellie asked ourselves, could this also be true for TOC? What do you think? Okay? Clear agreement there, right? An additional insight that we had when we looked at the first one is that we often cope with complexity with simple heuristics, right? We develop a heuristic, a kind of a fight or flight freeze mode of thinking. So when you hear high reward, what does this heuristic warn us about? Is that high reward must mean high risk or high cost, either one or two or both. And as a result, it's a bad idea to support it. So whenever you hear a claim of high reward, for the majority of the people, it triggers an emotional reaction. Stay away from this thing. Can't trust it. Snake oil salesman. There must be something that they don't tell me, because reality doesn't give you high rewards unless you were prepared to take high risk or put in the investment, right? About the specific reason, another insight that we had was, I don't know how many of you it's happened to before, it happens to me all the time. I try to explain something as simple as possible. Often we overcomplicate it, but say I was successful. The person gets excited. They go back into the organization. They go, oh, I just attended this really incredible workshop, got such major insights from. The guy said, so, like, what is it? And what were the insights? And they tried to explain, and they were right at that left-hand side of that curve, right? And now they're struggling. And at some point, they say, no, you have to speak to the guy directly, right? I'm struggling to explain it, and the person is either going, look, this doesn't make sense to me at all, or, oh my gosh, he's become a zealot of this crazy thing. And what happens that we realize is that when somebody struggles to understand or explain something, it exposes them as a non-expert in their field. Does it make sense? And that's probably one of the worst things that can happen to you as a professional. I should know this stuff, and I tried to explain it, I couldn't convince somebody. So what's the natural reaction? Just don't try. Come up with a reason not to do it. Going a little bit further is, this was one of the quotes that I put on my desk when I was busy doing my PhD. Good reminder to all of us. A designer knows he has achieved perfection, not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. So we asked ourselves, considering the TOC knowledge base, it looks like we're adding all the time. Who's taking stuff away? Absolutely, right? Great example this morning to say, what if all these other things that we thought was the major contributor of the gap does play a role, but it's quite a small role. Of course, multitasking and Parkinson's syndrome and student syndrome, all of those things help, but are they the major causes? Maybe they explain this much. Maybe the essence of it is focus and finish. So, you can laugh about it when, you say one of the principles of TOC is inherent simplicity, and you say, by the way, this is what we're going to teach you. That's simple, right? And there's really nothing you can take away from that picture that will somehow compromise the value that somebody would get, right? And many of you, including myself, people like Sanjeev, we are constantly trying to figure out what can we take away. Not what can we add. What can we take away? So then we went to the other giant and said, what did Ellie give us that we could also potentially use to answer this question? And he came up with this idea of necessary but not sufficient in a book that he co-wrote with Ellie Schragenheim and Carol Patak. And again, he kind of proposed a generic reason why few organizations that have implemented MRP systems and later ERP systems, why so few of them really got value. And the majority of them didn't. Why? And he said there's kind of a generic reason and a specific reason. The generic reason is that technology can bring value if and only if it diminishes a limitation for the user. So if it doesn't diminish a limitation, don't expect to get value from it. If you're just replacing one thing with another one, and it's not diminishing, don't expect to get value. There was a specific reason, and I think that was a profound insight, is that before the technology, people had to live with this limitation. They developed coping mechanisms to live with this limitation. We call them local optima rules. And local optima doesn't mean I'm purposely trying to optimize the part at the expense of the whole. Even though, that can happen, it's probably few times that really happens. Most of what we mean by local optimization is I'm using rules and data and insights and impacts that I have available locally to decide what to do. And often the global optimal rules are counterintuitive from the local perspective. So unless I change those old rules, I can't expect to get value. And so we started thinking about if we're doing a theory of constraints implementation, and theory of constraints now is the technology, what limitation does it actually diminish? And what was the rules that were put in place? And by rules, we mean policies, metrics, behaviors, any coping mechanism to acknowledge or live with those limitations. And did we change them or not? And if we didn't, should we be surprised that people are not getting the full value from it and are not spreading the word about it? So these are the questions for those that have not seen this before, just as a brief overview. The essence of it in terms of what Ellie wrote in Necessary but Not Sufficient is if you think about a material requirements planning system, the power of that system is that it could do net material requirements calculations, very complex calculations through complex BOMs and routings overnight. Well, before MRP existed, how did people live with a limitation? The limitation was the time it took to do those calculations. So people developed a rule that said, let's only do this once a month. So we accumulate all the orders, and then once a month we'll sit down and we'll explode it through and we'll figure out what procurement orders, what production orders, what distribution orders to go in place. And then we'll do it again next month. So was this rule of doing it only once a month ever challenged? And it turns out that in many of the implementations, it was never changed. They still ran the MRP once a month. So all the expected benefits that I'll become much more responsive, I'll be able to reduce my inventories, didn't happen. So let's go and apply this to TOC and see if we can get some insights. Firstly, from Dr. Ellie Goldratt, what is the real power of the technology? There's an association that says if management attention is the ultimate constraint in an organization, it's not the market, it's not cash, it's not supply, it's not capacity. Why is it none of those things? Because unless you have 100% of the market in the world, or 100% of the cash, or 100% of the supply, or capacity, or land, or whatever other input you need, you can't claim that's the thing that's limiting your growth. The only thing, the only resource that satisfies the definition of a constraint is management attention. Because a number of things that will demand your attention will always exceed your available attention. And as a result, anything that helps you to decide what and who to pay attention to is extremely powerful for you. So kind of the limitation is one of the limitations, at least in this complex world where there are so many people and so many things to do, what do I pay attention to? As a consequence of that, there's also the other side that says it's not just about knowing what to do, but as importantly, knowing what not to do. And Ellie talked about, in Standing on the Shoulders, the importance of having simple, practical mechanisms to tell people when not to produce. The buffer is full, stop producing. The Kanban is full, stop producing, don't release. There was an insight, maybe some of you have seen this, as I was doing research when I was doing my PhD about this topic. I was quite surprised to find out that Herbert Simon, another one of my heroes that was a pioneer in AI and ops research, wrote a paper in 1973 where he said the information processing systems of our contemporary world swim in an exceedingly rich soup of data and information. In a world of this kind, the scarce resource is not data or even information, it's processing capacity to attend to that information. Attention is the chief bottleneck in organizational activity, and a bottleneck becomes narrower and narrower as we move to the top of the organization. TOC can provide managers with practical mechanisms to know what to focus on and what not. I think that's the power. So what limitation can TOC help diminish? These are the things that managers will always face when they have to decide what and who to pay attention to and how to make decisions. They will always have incomplete data and knowledge. They'll never be able to accurately predict the full consequences. They'll always have limited attention, resources, time. Global optimal rules are often very counterintuitive from a local perspective. And probably the worst of all, they will likely be blamed if things fail. That's the realities. So asking managers to make better, faster decisions and predictions in an environment that contains all this complexity puts significant stress on them. And this is a picture that I've presented before, but you take these VUCA environments, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, constraints, ambiguity, you put people in there, you ask them to make decisions, and they develop coping mechanisms. Some of those coping mechanisms have unavoidable decision mistakes, and some of it results in avoidable decision mistakes. Some of those avoidable ones are consequential. So part of what we realize, what we should be focusing on is identifying those parts of TOC that can help managers in organizations reduce or maybe even prevent avoidable and consequential decision mistakes. Knowing that a mistake, first of all, is unavoidable or avoidable is as important. And as I mentioned, TOC can really help in those aspects of how to set goals, how to judge the system impact of local changes, deciding where to focus, what rules to use, and when to change the rules. And we'll have more in the paper around that. So if we know the limitation it can help diminish, what limitation can it not help diminish? And I want to show you a simple simulation. Maybe some of you have seen it, but it kind of illustrates the point about the boundary conditions of what we do in TOC. It's called The Game of Life by John Conway. He said, imagine a system where you have every cell is surrounded by 8 neighbors, and the status of that cell, whether it's alive or dead, is purely determined by the neighbors, how many neighbors there are around it. So if there's less than 2 neighbors, it dies from loneliness. If there's more than 3, it dies of starvation. If there's exactly 2 or 3, it stays alive. And if there's exactly 3 around it, it gets born if it was dead. And the question is, such simple rules, and I know the starting conditions, so it's deterministic. I know the starting conditions. Can I predict what will happen to that system where there's now 3 and 4 little live cells there? If I apply those rules iteratively, what will be the outcome that I expect? One outcome is everything dies. Another outcome is some intermediate pattern, right? It can't be that everything becomes alive because of the rules. But let's see if we can see what happens and how sensitive this could be to changes. Essentially what happens, what you'll see is that this thing starts creating very, very interesting patterns. And a very small change can have a dramatic impact on the pattern that is created. It literally starts looking like this thing is alive, and it starts just feeding all over the time. And just a small change in one of the starting conditions changes the pattern completely. And that's what we often find in organizations. Our organizations is quite sensitive to starting conditions. I showed a graph on the exponential growth in Q, what you see in the traffic system, right? A small little accident somewhere on the side of the road can immediately cause congestion and traffic jams. And that becomes a big issue, because when you see the congestion and you're trying to go back and say what caused it, it's extremely hard, if not impossible, to determine the cause going backwards. Let's look at another challenge of how do I figure out what rules to use. Imagine you had a decision where you need to consider only 2 things. Say you're a doctor that has to do a diagnosis, and you have to decide whether the patient has these 2 symptoms or not. And based on that signs or symptoms, you can then decide what the rules should be to treat this patient. You can see here that 2 variables with 2 outcomes, so 2 to the power of 4 gives you 16 possible rules that you could have come up with to treat this patient. Imagine now having 8 variables that you have to consider to make a decision, to come up with a heuristic of how to manage the system or do a diagnosis. And each of them have 5 outcomes. That's 1 trillion different permutations, 2 to the power of 40, right? Those are the complexities that we face in reality. We have to come up with decision rules in the face of huge complexity. How many variables do you need to consider every time you make a decision? And how do you do that? That's why it takes us 10 years, 20 years to become an expert at something. We need to see enough of these patterns to be able to recognize them and get feedback about what works and what doesn't. And these are things that TOC doesn't directly address unless you say you treat the TOC applications of how do we set buffers as a heuristic that is remarkably robust against various demand patterns, and say, will it always give you the right buffer? No, it won't. But remarkably, it will give you the right one about for the majority of the cases. What rules should we use now? We presented 2 aspects, and there's a lot of detail in here that I'm not going to go into, but we presented it from a practical perspective in terms of how you do planning, execution, and measurement. In planning, there's 2 decisions that we make. Decisions before we start doing the work. For example, how should we allocate resources? Should we allocate it based on demand forecast? Or should we wait, keep the resource in the most aggregated point, and only allocate it when we know what the queue is or the demand on that? So there's a right way and a wrong way of dealing with each of these questions. The TOC part provides us with insights of how to answer these really complicated questions about how to allocate resources, how to give reliable commitments, how to control the WIP, how to decide what priorities to follow, how to decide which metrics to use, and where and when to focus our improvements or initiatives. There's another aspect that TOC can help. What the new rule should be is it says when you are facing all these obstacles, what is the wrong way of dealing with complexity, with uncertainty, with conflicts? This is part of our known knowledge base, but it provides people with very useful frameworks when they are confronted by these things and we ask them to make decisions. So what changes are required in TOC itself? And this is the last slide that we'll end up with. Can we apply the concept of antifragility to TOC that says for something to survive, it needs to have a small downside if it fails and a big upside if it succeeds? So if we want to get people to consider TOC as a change, we have to be able to convince them that if they make this change, there's a very small downside if it doesn't work, but a really big upside if it does. So we have to also apply this to our knowledge base. One of the key criteria for antifragility is that you discard things that are not helping. We need to find out what are these things that in our TOC knowledge base that's not really helping and may even be harming. Going back to the essence like what Sanjeev proposed this morning. We have to find practical ways to address the real fears that managers have in adopting an approach like TOC. We can use simulation models to show the enemy as us, right? But in a fun way, where people blame themselves and they realize that we face a huge amount of complexity and uncertainty, but a big portion of the performance gap is we simply using the wrong rules. And why have we used the wrong rules? Because we were looking at what's available locally, what's the local impact of those rules. It's really counterintuitive to make these assessments. We can use simulations also to allow people to build up the intuition they need. They won't support something if they don't have the intuition to predict the outcome. Simulations can shortcut that. They can press the play button and see how much better they will do, especially if you use data from their environment. So they can't say, that's too simple, we are different. We can also use it to show that TOC is a very low-risk, low-cost way to get rapid improvements, and that these TOC rules are remarkably robust across a wide spectrum of outcomes. The last one that might be a little bit controversial, I had many discussions with Ellie Schragen about this, and before I introduce you a short story, I was sitting with Ellie in his office, and there was a person presenting a breakthrough that they've made in sales. And it was incredible. They'd figured out what it takes to sell more of this specific product. And this person was the owner of a very, very large company. And he was telling us how successful this new sales approach is. And I said to him, that's amazing. So how long have you been doing this? He said, about 3 years. I said, what's the result? He said, every time we train somebody on this new approach, sales goes up by 20 to 30%. Now, if you know the leverage in sales, you know that 1% typically gives you a 10% increase in net profit. So if you're going from 20, 30%, you should be getting increases in net profit of 200, 300%. And I looked at their financials and I said, but I don't see that profit. Have you trained all your salespeople on this approach? He said, no, only about 30%. I said, why is that? Did you find that it doesn't work everywhere? He said, no, it works everywhere. We've checked it. I said, but why aren't you training everybody on it? He says, because our culture is not to dictate. Our culture is not to dictate. We don't tell people what to do. I said, that's complete rubbish. He says, what do you mean? He was quite offended. I said, do you tell people how to report their financials? He said, yes. I said, do you tell people what HR policies to follow? Yes. I said, do you understand where I'm coming from? When things are required, rules are required to benefit the system, especially if they're counterintuitive, you can't expect people to decide, oh, I want to be trained on this thing. And then on top of that, when I asked him, so, what's the requirements to be trained? You have to pay for it yourself. Okay. Right? And this was a very good friend of Ellie's. And we had a lot of discussion about that. One of our conclusions that was reconfirmed here is if new rules, like TOC rules, takes effort to do, or they are counterintuitive, either one of those, automate what can be automated. Don't expect people to do it. Figure out what the rules are, build them into the system, and automate them. We can show with our simulation models like the one that you saw from Tata yesterday and what I previously presented with Microsoft. One thing that struck the executives is the rules that we implemented there to show the benefits were all fully automated, right? The computer was deciding what rules to follow, considering all the complexities. It's much, much better than humans to do. And a simple rule for you to use, when is AI required? Anything that's hard for humans to do, AI finds easy. And anything that AI and robotics find hard to do, typically humans find easy. So let's not confuse those. Anything that can be automated should. And if you cannot, then the worst possible thing you can do is to measure people on their performance. Remember, we said it takes a lot of effort, and it's counterintuitive. So if I measure you on your performance, but I want you to follow a rule that takes a lot of effort, that you think will take away the time that you have to achieve the performance, or it's counterintuitive, you won't follow the rules. Or you'll justify not following them all the time, and then we'll never know whether the rules was really the right rules or not. So our strong recommendation, and we know it's quite controversial, is to stop using any form of performance metrics at the local level. If you have discovered what the right rule is to benefit the whole system, measure people on compliance to the rule. But explain to them that the reason why we want to do that is we want to check if these rules really work or not. And as long as we don't know if everybody's complying to the rule, we can never do that check. The final thing I'll end up with is this gave us a realization about what the third step of the 5 focusing steps. Subordinate everything to the above decision. The decision not to waste a constraint, which is management attention. What does it actually mean? It has 2 components. Insubordination means I didn't follow the rules that could have benefited the system. But there's another form of insubordination, which is I followed the rules that you gave me, knowing that they would cause damage, and I didn't tell you. And we think that that's the way to empower people, is to say to them, you contribute towards figuring out what rules to use to benefit the system. And we can use simulations, we can use safe-to-fail experiments. We'll figure it out, and then we're going to comply fully to them. However, if you know that something is wrong, that it could cause damage, and you don't tell us, that's what you're going to be held accountable for. So you will only be held accountable for not complying or for not speaking up and complying. And that's where we want to leave it. I hope that the few insights that we've gained was valuable in sharing. We have a full paper that has been written with that. It contains a lot more details. And we would welcome any questions or comments that you have, and please challenge us. Thank you.
Theory of constraints imposes exponential growth and improvement and change within organizations. And I think in biology, any system that's runaway exponential eventually hits some sort of balancing process. I wonder if the rate at which we're asking for change is not sustainable within some constants that we have within our wiring of just how much change the mind can accept. And I wonder if the compound rate of growth we see, say, across the S&P might be close to what the level of change the human organism can stand on average.
I agree. I think the first thing is it can, right? Not will, it can. Like I said, there are many, many ways to fail. There's very few ways to succeed. So we have to pay attention. And I realized, looking back at the strategy and tactic trees, remember when Ellie basically was adamant that you follow this thing step by step? And we all said, but that takes away our freedom to think. He wasn't being a bully. He was saying, I want to check if we figured out what it takes. And as long as I don't know that you are fully complying, we can never check if these rules are there. But I also agree with you. I think that people have limited attention. They have limited capacity for change. And one of the key requirements that we use on all of our projects, first step should always be, what can people stop doing? And measuring. Because unless they have the attention to start doing the things we want them to do, they can't. So first think about what they can stop doing and measuring.
Hi, I'm new to this group. It's my first time being here. I guess I had a little bit of different take on TOC. In some ways, it's all maybe a victim of its own success, right? Which is the goal has been so popular. Everybody gets the idea of a bottleneck.
Yeah.
It's almost everywhere you go. You talk about a bottleneck, got it. I'm done. Right? What else is there to know?
Yeah.
And then then everything else gets a lot more complicated, and you're telling people to do that. If they do less, they'll get more. You slow things down, they'll go faster. It all becomes very counterintuitive to everybody. And when you look at lean, it's a very simple rule, right? Take waste out. I can run all the programs I want. I'm going to take waste out. It's just a universally good thing apparently, but that's what they'll do, right? And Six Sigma is, I'm going to take variability out, and regardless of whether the variability mattered or not, I'm going to take variability out, and that's a good thing. So the very concept of TOC and all the things that come after that bottleneck idea are much more complicated and sophisticated than those other simple rule sets.
I think they are, but they can also be simplified. So one of the areas that if you de-bottleneck, you actually create balanced capacities. It's an extreme form of local optimization. So when people interpret TOC as debottlenecking, we need to make them aware, and the best way of showing it is with a dice game. You have a system that has been debottlenecked, balanced capacities. You think it will do 70, in 20 days, 3.5 times 20, and then they get half of that if there's not decoupling points. So those type of simulations where people can experience the impact of balanced capacities, not having enough protective capacity or the right buffers, is the way that we get executives to start paying attention. And then we say to them, okay, how do we translate that to your complex environment? So I think in summary, there's a generic reason why people resist change, is that they won't support it if they don't have the intuition to predict what will happen. And especially if they think it's going to be high risk or high cost. So we have to address that. And the second thing is that they won't adopt it if the language is complicated, if we can't explain it in simple ways. And that's on us. We have to figure out how to get the messaging much, much more simpler and discard all the things that are unnecessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan.